sharp scent of rubbing alcohol and the sterile white glow of an emergency room are sometimes the final, most painful memories a person carries with them. Imagine lying there, swallowed by stark white hospital sheets, your body trembling, not only from the cold air pouring from the vents, but from the unbearable agony radiating through a collarbone that has just been brutally shattered. Around your bleeding wrist rests a neon pink hospital identification band, eerily still in contrast to the frantic heartbeat pounding inside your chest. With bruised and swollen fingers, the woman struggles to gather the last remnants of her strength, painstakingly typing out a desperate message to her mother. "He tried to kill me." Those were not exaggerated words spoken in panic. They were not the bitter cries of someone overwhelmed by suffering. Terrifyingly, they were a farewell. She knew death was calling her name. She knew that the monster hiding behind a human face would not stop until she had taken her final breath. But if she knew she was going to die, why didn't she simply run? SP Crime warmly welcomes all of you. Before we step into the chilling darkness to unravel the horrifying mystery behind that question, if you appreciate these deeper perspectives and wish to join me in seeking justice for the vulnerable, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to continue digging deeper and bringing you even more haunting and meticulously researched cases in the future. Today, I don't simply want to tell you about a murder. I want us to uncover a heartbreaking tragedy that exposed the decay of a justice system and revealed the cruel psychological trap known as coercive control. Many outsiders are quick to ask, why didn't she just leave? But the truth is far more complicated. Under the grip of psychological manipulation, victims become prisoners inside an invisible cage, where the line between life and death grows so thin that escaping can seem even more terrifying and potentially more devastating than enduring the abuse itself. But before darkness consumed her life, I want you to remember our victim today with the dignity and respect she deserves. She was never meant to become a cold body in a forensic report. Her name was Heather Gumina. She was 33 years old. Though she worked hard as a waitress to support herself and her family, the title she cherished most, the one that brought her the greatest pride and happiness, was being the mother of 3 young children. Anyone who crossed paths with Heather remembered her bright spirit, her innocent warmth, and a heart that endlessly longed to love and be loved. She carried a vibrant energy that was reflected in her passion for the color pink. You could spot Heather from a distance, dressed in bright outfits and adorned with cute accessories. Most memorable of all was her black Infiniti, proudly customized with eye-catching pink accents that perfectly reflected her personality. But sometimes, this world can be especially cruel to kind people. Heather's compassion, trusting nature, and open heart ultimately made her the perfect prey, the ideal target, for a predator lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment to reveal his fangs. The black hole waiting to consume Heather's pink-filled world came in the form of a charming man, a man who carefully wove a counterfeit web of love known as Anthony Gumina. Anthony did not enter Heather's life looking like a monster. He arrived disguised as a savior. Confident, charismatic, and quick with words, he seemed to offer exactly what a single mother longed for most: safety and stability. In the beginning, he employed a classic psychological tactic that criminologists refer to as love bombing. He surrounded Heather with sweet words, expensive gifts, and promises of a complete family for her and her 3 children. To a woman who had spent much of her life yearning for affection, that overwhelming attention felt intoxicating. She mistook toxic possessiveness for passionate love. She mistook pathological jealousy for genuine devotion. Their wedding day came, but instead of opening the door to happiness, it marked the chilling sound of a lock clicking shut on a prison. The moment the marriage certificate was signed, Anthony's mask began to crack. Coercive control rarely starts with violent punches. Instead, it seeps into a victim's life like poison, slowly paralyzing every part of their existence. First, he severed Heather's connections to the outside world. He complained about her friends, picked fights with her family, and manufactured arguments that left her emotionally exhausted until she gradually isolated herself from everyone who cared about her. He controlled the finances. He monitored her phone. And he planted a devastating belief in her mind that no one else in the world needed her, and no one else could ever love her. Little by little, the confidence and spirit that once defined Heather began to disappear, replaced by fear, anxiety, and the constant feeling that she had to walk on eggshells inside her own home. Then came the violence. At first, they were slaps excused as moments of lost temper, but the assaults soon escalated into something far more horrifying. Cruelly, after every attack, Anthony performed a flawless act of remorse. He cried, begged for forgiveness, and swore that he would change. The cycle of abuse tightened around Heather's neck like a noose, leaving her emotionally shattered, unable to fight back, and too terrified to escape. Because she wasn't only afraid for herself. She feared for the children who shared the same roof with a killer disguised as a husband and a father. But no mask of kindness can conceal evil forever. And eventually, the darkness came crashing down. On one fateful night, the line separating psychological domination from murderous brutality was finally crossed. Let's return to the haunting image we spoke of at the beginning of this story. On a night in mid-July 2019, the full extent of Anthony's cruelty came crashing down upon Heather's fragile body. He beat her so savagely that her collarbone was broken, bent out of place, while bruises spread across her body like death sentences already written in advance. Lying in a hospital bed with a neon pink identification bracelet around her wrist, Heather sent one final desperate message to her mother. He tried to kill me. It was a moment of painful awakening, a heartbreaking cry rising from the depths of despair. But where was the system designed to protect victims that night? Despite bearing the unmistakable injuries of severe domestic violence, Heather somehow returned to the very den of the monster who had nearly killed her. Perhaps she had been threatened. Perhaps her children were still in his hands. Or perhaps years of manipulation and trauma bonding had stripped away the last remnants of her will to survive. We may never know the exact reason, because after leaving that hospital, Heather Gumina vanished from the world forever. The following morning, an eerie silence settled over everything. Haunted by the alarming message she had received the night before, Heather's mother desperately tried to reach her daughter, but all she heard in return were endless rings and empty silence. Then came another disturbing discovery. Heather's black infinity, decorated with the bright pink accents she loved so much, a symbol of her vibrant personality and pride, was found abandoned in a remote area. It stood there alone, cold and lifeless, like a wordless grave marker foreshadowing a tragic end. Friends and family began to fear the worst. A devoted mother who loved her children more than life itself, and a woman who embraced beauty and joy the way Heather did, would never simply disappear without taking anything with her. And she certainly would never abandon her 3 young children. Heather's disappearance was not the act of a woman running away to find freedom. It was the brutal extinguishing of a human life. The vibrant pink that had once defined her existence had now been swallowed by the darkness of evil, leaving behind unbearable confusion and a void that could never be filled in the hearts of those she loved. And as Heather's voice faded into permanent silence, a desperate search began, one that would gradually expose the clumsy lies of a cold-blooded killer. As soon as law enforcement became involved, all eyes turned toward Anthony Gumina. Sensing that the walls were closing in around him, he began performing perhaps the worst role of his life, that of a grieving and bewildered husband desperate to find his missing wife. He appeared on television, pretending to be concerned. He fabricated bizarre stories, claiming that Heather had argued with him before storming out. At one point, he even had the audacity to suggest that she had run away with another man. But the deception of a violent predator could not fool seasoned investigators. And above all, it could not deceive the instincts of a mother searching for her daughter. Piece by piece, the evidence began to come together. Tiny traces of blood were discovered inside the home. Anthony's statements about the timeline were riddled with contradictions, and his disturbing history of domestic violence quickly came to light. Then, investigators uncovered a chilling detail. Shortly after Heather returned home from the hospital that night, Anthony had contacted an acquaintance and asked to borrow an excavator. It was the kind of revelation that sent a cold wave through the investigators' veins. As the weeks passed, hope of finding Heather alive began to slip away like the final grains of sand in an hourglass. And then, the worst fears became reality. In early September 2019, authorities discovered the body of Heather Gumina. She had been buried beneath cold, filthy soil in a remote area of El Dorado County, not far from where Anthony had once lived. The contrast was almost unbearable. A woman who had always loved cleanliness, beauty, and everything bright and pink now lay hidden beneath dark earth and mud. It was a cruel irony that brought many to tears. The autopsy confirmed what everyone had feared. Heather had been brutally murdered shortly after leaving the emergency room. Anthony had never intended to stop. The moment she reached out for help and sent that desperate message, he made the decision to silence forever the only witness to his crimes. In the end, his clumsy lies collapsed under the crushing weight of the truth, exposing a soul consumed by darkness and corruption. Though her body had been buried deep beneath the ground, Heather's cry for justice continued to echo, and that cry forced both the legal system and all of us to confront a painful and unsettling truth. Anthony Gumina's trial unfolded under an atmosphere of anger, grief, and unbearable tension. Faced with overwhelming evidence that could no longer be denied, the killer ultimately pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his days growing old behind bars. But was that truly justice? Could such a punishment ever bring a loving mother back to the 3 children left behind, with emotional scars that would never fully heal? The answer is no. While the sentence punished the perpetrator, it also served as a powerful indictment of a system that failed to protect one of its most vulnerable victims. Heather's death raises painful questions. Why was a woman admitted to the hospital with a shattered collarbone caused by severe abuse allowed to return home to the very man who inflicted those injuries? Why were her desperate cries for help not met with immediate protection and emergency intervention? Where did we go wrong? How did a human life slip through the cracks of the justice system and fall straight into death? Heather Gumina's story is more than a murder case. It is a bloody wake-up call about the realities of domestic violence and the devastating effects of psychological manipulation. It shatters the cruel assumption society so often places on victims. Why didn't she just leave? Because leaving an abuser is not as simple as walking out the front door. For many victims, it is the most dangerous moment of their lives, a moment when survival itself depends on the brutality of the person determined to maintain control. Instead of judging victims, we must understand their helplessness. Instead of asking why they stayed, perhaps we should ask whether we have built strong enough systems to help them escape safely. Today, Heather is no longer with us, but her spirit and the love she carried for her children remains. Those who loved her continued to tie bright pink ribbons in memory of a beautiful soul whose life was stolen far too soon. Remember Heather Gumina not as a helpless victim, but as a mother who fought until her final breath. A reminder that no one deserves to live in fear. And that domestic violence is not a private matter hidden behind closed doors. It is a crime that must be brought into the light and confronted by society as a whole. Thank you for joining me through this heartbreaking story, and I hope to see you again in future case files as we continue to shine a light on the truth and pursue justice for those whose voices have been silenced. Final thoughts. The tragedy of Heather Gumina, but the pain it left behind continues to linger, especially for the 3 young children who were robbed forever of their mother's love. The beautiful golden cage, disguised in sweet words and promises, ultimately suffocated a vibrant soul who embraced life and cherished everything pink. Her death was not merely the tragic conclusion of a murder case. It became a bloody indictment exposing both the devastating reality of domestic violence and the weaknesses of the systems meant to protect victims. That shattered collarbone, and the desperate message she sent from the emergency room that fateful night, should have been her final opportunity for survival. It should have been the lifeline that pulled her away from death. Instead, the line between life and death was erased by the manipulative cruelty of her abuser and the fatal failures of the system around her. Behind Anthony Gumina's life sentence lies a void that can never be filled in the hearts of those who loved Heather. Though her life ended beneath cold and unforgiving soil, her suffering sounded an alarm that society can no longer ignore. Domestic violence is never a private issue hidden behind closed doors. It is a cruel crime that steals lives, dignity, and freedom. And this case reminds us that silence, acceptance, and indifference are often the very conditions in which evil is allowed to flourish. Lessons learned, and how to apply them to real life. Perhaps the most important lesson from this case is understanding the difference between genuine love and toxic control. Abuse does not always begin with fists. It often starts with love bombing, empty promises, jealousy disguised as affection, and the gradual isolation of victims from the people who care about them. How can we apply these lessons in our own lives? First, establish clear personal boundaries in every relationship. Never compromise when someone attempts to control your finances, invade your privacy, monitor your phone or social media, or intentionally make you feel worthless. Second, maintain a strong support network of trusted family members and friends. Having people to rely on during difficult times can make all the difference. And finally, if you, or someone you know, is experiencing abuse, do not suffer in silence. Leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous phase. Seek professional guidance and protection from authorities or support organizations before taking action, so that safety remains the highest priority. Before we end today's case, I'd like to ask you a question. In your opinion, what is the most alarming red flag someone can show during the early stages of a romantic relationship? Please feel free to share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. By learning from one another, perhaps we can help others recognize toxic relationships before it's too late. And if you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support motivates us to continue producing more compelling and valuable true crime documentaries in the future. Until next time, stay safe and never stop seeking the truth.